Welcome back to Sussex.
Thank you.
I heard you say in another interview that you thought history was about the details, and this made me think, is there something that historical fiction can offer us in terms of an insight into the past that traditional history cannot? And if so, what is this?
I think it can do two things principally. One is that, in a way, if you want to know somebody, you look, of course, at what they've done and if they've left any writing, what their writings are. But what the historian then does almost unconsciously is what a novelist does, which is to construct from that their view of the person. And that's an imaginative construction. History is a work of imagination, in a way. You couldn't write an account of any historical event without first imagining it. And of course, you imagine it from the documents or the artifacts that you have before you. But the actual work of finding something to tell the reader occurs in the historian's imagination. Well, it occurs in the novelist's imagination in really exactly the same way, except there's more freedom. So in one way, I think it's a very, very similar process. The other thing that I think historical fiction can do, which I find incredibly inspiring, is that sometimes there are gaps in the record which really have to be accounted for, and the historian can't account for them because there's a gap. All the historian can say is like, we don't know what happened then. This person disappears, they come back with potatoes. Okay, probably they went to America. Like, we know that, but in a sense it's historical fiction to say that he went to America, unless you've got the record. So historical fiction can fill the gaps in a very powerful way, not just in a sense of somebody goes and then they come back, what did they do in the meantime? But sometimes what they did in the meantime, for which you have no record, is suggested by the records, but the historical fiction can genuinely, vividly bridge that gap.
I mean, history as an academic discipline, if we're kind of juxtaposing the two, is kind of commonly seen to be in decline at the moment. So kind of traditional classical books of history, people seem less interested in reading. Despite this, historical fiction seems more popular than ever, in terms of your own work, books of Hilary Mantel, but also in terms of period dramas, so Downton Abbey and even Mad Men. I mean, why do you think it is that fictitious representations of the past are so popular at the moment? And is it a good thing people are getting their history through this kind of medium?
It would be disastrous if that was the only way they were getting their history, but certainly I know from what my readers tell me and write to me, a lot of people start with the fiction and then go to a history. And although academic history, school history may be in decline, I really think that popular history, history on television, documentary history, is really, really thriving. I mean, I notice how many programmes people ask me to contribute to, what the interest is in the history behind the novels. So I really think that what we're seeing is a revival of history in a certain way, and that's going to spill out. So I think there's a lot of people at school now who are reading about the Plantagenets, who would then take an interest in history and go on to university and study probably something else altogether.
So history's kind of evolving rather than necessarily declining and kind of changing the way it's communicated.
Like everything else, it comes in and out of fashion.
Yeah.
But I think what's happened is what really inspired me at Sussex, what I really learned at Sussex, was the new history, which was the history of, both micro-history and radical history, and the history of dissent and the history of poor working class people, race history and women's history. In a sense, that was a takeoff, that was a new fashion in history, which has come through from everyone in my generation. So people like Simon Sharma like that sort of history too. I love that sort of history. My fiction is like that, Sharma's history is like that. And that's, I think, inspired a whole new wave. So really what I think you're seeing is the tail end of a less, to me, less interesting form of history and the rise of a new form.
Well, in recent decades, history has been kind of recalibrated by what's widely referred to as the cultural turn. So historians are turning their attention more to the stories that people use to make sense of their world and their past, rather than pursuing an objective truth or past. Do you think there's any kind of relationship between this intellectual change and development in the last few decades and the growing popularity of historical fiction?
Absolutely, I do. And I think there's a dialogue, because basically what we're talking about is narrative. And I think there was a time, certainly I experienced the end of it when I was doing my A-levels, when you were required to study a document. And really it could have been totally It could have dropped from Mars. You know, it was of really no, it was not related to anything else. It certainly wasn't related to anything you might be interested in, for fear of getting people interested in history, you know, which would be disaster. But you know, then I came to Sussex, and I actually didn't come to Sussex to read history. I came to read English, and I just fell in love with history, because what I discovered here was a narrative which I hadn't even known existed. And it was a narrative about dissent and a narrative about oppression and, you know, class warfare against it. And that was just a thrilling, but it's a narrative.
It's still a story, but
it's a story. And I think really that what we're seeing is the rise of history as a story again.
Yeah.
And it, you know, it was like that, and then it went out of fashion. Now it's kind of
reclaiming that.
Yeah, I think so.
Its nature. I want to ask you a quick question about sex, if that's okay.
But certainly. I've just been waiting for once to get round to it.
Sex is a major theme in your novels, but not just this. It's often the very motor of historical change. So Henry's lust for Anne is what, you know, ultimately brings about the English Reformation. Is sexual desire then transhistorical? I mean, was lust felt then in the same way it's felt now, or do sensibilities have a history?
Sensibilities certainly have a history. Lust was certainly felt then, not in the same way that it is now. There's so much more forbidden. There's so many more obstacles from women's fear of pregnancy, from women being chattels and therefore not available, sexually available until they're married to the man, to the church's prohibition of female desire. So that in itself is a sin. To have sex for pleasure is in itself a sin. So it's totally different from the way that we think about it now. Having said that, I think it is a motor of change very occasionally. The question of Henry's feelings for Anne Boleyn are very, very powerful, and that is a really great example. Edward IV marries Elizabeth Woodville for lust or love, whatever you choose to call it. But by and large, it's not a determining force in big histories. But of course, to anyone who's interested in individuals, of course it's interesting. And I think, I mean, it's obviously very much part of the tradition of historical fiction, which at the sort of purple end becomes a romantic historical, you know, novel. So often it's just about love. It's not really about history at all. Right. But even at the furthest end, I think you have to account for the fact that historical people do feel a lot of passion, but they will feel it differently from modern people.
Right, yes.
It's hard to allow for that.
Yeah. I think watching your films, that's kind of the thing that strikes me, is that kind of, that thing with history in general, where you try and put yourself in the place of those people at that time, whether those emotions were perhaps the same ones or perhaps they've been shaped by the historical conditions. I'm sure they're different, and I think something like parenting is very different as well, right. And that's very hard for people to get their heads round. So for instance, an aristocratic medieval woman would hand her baby over practically at the moment of birth to his wet nurse, and then she would just have him back, in a sense, for them to see each other. But the idea of a maternal bond, the idea of feeding her own baby, the idea of really committing, you know, passionately to a child, isn't part of the medieval idea of aristocratic mothering. And that's extraordinary to have to explain to modern people, who would describe that as bad mothering. It isn't. You know, it's very, very good medieval mothering, which is different. It's just different, yeah. I mean, why did the Tudors make such compelling popular history? Well, it is sex. I mean, because everybody thinks Henry VIII married 6 wives, and everybody thinks he married them for 6 episodes of lust. Yeah. So the popular view of Henry VIII is as a kind of Bluebeard, and most people think he killed everybody. You know, like, so you've got that. But also, they are the most fantastic set of characters. You know, they are genuinely, I think, larger than life, the women as well as the men. So you do have extraordinary, not just the ones we know, not just Henry and the wives, but the mistresses are quite extraordinary. Some, you know, he's got a couple of bastard children who are very behaving, you know, it's a time of religious reformation, so the opportunity for standing on your principles and martyrdom is there as well. There's an awful lot going on, and really heroic people rise to the surface and make it to the record, so we know they're interesting. Having said that, popular culture adores Henry VIII, because you see this, you know,
Holbein's Henry, this enormous stocky king, and you think of him as this sort of chocolate box king. And so one of the things I think that modern novels do with the Henry image is describe it in a different way. So Hilary Mantel's Henry is not like that. My Henry is not like that.
Okay, yes. I mean, in terms of that image of Henry, I want to ask you a question about kind of gender and how that works in your books. I mean, most of your novels do have strong female characters at the centre of their narratives. I mean, do you consider yourself a writer of feminist literature?
Oh yes, absolutely, from the very beginning.
What does the term mean to you at the moment?
To be a feminist means to me at the moment that you're basically supporting equal opportunity for women in every area. To write feminist literature, I think, is to focus upon the story of women, and for me to seek out, and when I can find them, tell the story of women who play against the stereotype of vulnerability and submissiveness. So even when I'm writing about Catherine Howard, who is clearly a very ill-educated, quite silly, very young woman, it's actually a story about a woman trying to find her way in a world which is not designed to help her. And in that sense, even telling the story of someone who was ultimately the victim of judicial execution, of murder, it's still the story of someone who's fighting for her life and fighting for an opportunity to become the person that she should be.
So your series, The White Queen, is currently being filmed by the BBC. Will be shown next summer. I mean, what's it like to have characters that you created represented on screen? What's it like when you first kind of see them?
It really depends on the filming, and it really depends so much on the script. What I notice now, having been involved in a number of dramatisations, adaptations of my novels into film, is it's the script that worries me the most. It's the script that I get most unhappy about. So it's still the words. If it's a script that I like, and I'm so pleased that this is going to be a very, very big series for BBC One, Sunday night, 9 o'clock. I mean, the historical slot that you really want to be in. I really like the script. I have script approval, and I really liked it, and the performances are stunning. And it's an almost completely pleasurable experience, whereas working on something where the screenwriter has, in a sense, taken some of the story, but not all of it, certainly not taken my prejudices and my views and my biases, and in a sense produced sometimes a really very good film. It's a very odd experience. It's quite dislocating. It's like somebody did a film about your mother. You know, you don't like it really.
It's
you know,
intimate to you.
It feels intimate. Yeah.
I'm thinking about kind of the most famous reproduction of your work, The Other Bolingo. Did you have any say about things like casting? For example, casting of, say, Henry, or of course Anne, even the physicality or the visuals of them could perhaps have implications.
When I first sold the option for an adaptation, we thought, it makes me smile even now, we thought we were going to make a very small scale, sort of little arty cinema movie, which would be really quite different about Henry VIII, but more about how to be a woman in Tudor England. You could try and be queen, or you could find your own way, and your own way would lead you ultimately to quite a normal, relatively poor, domestic Tudor life. Well, a Hollywood producer got wind of this, got hold of the book, bought up the script from the people I had already sold it to, so it went into joint production. They then spent, by the end of the day, £72 million on this production, at which point, you know, they say to you, would you like Eric Bana? And you just go, ah. They say to you, we've cast Natalie Portman, we've cast Scarlett Johansson. You're not going to argue about it. And if you did argue about it, they'd say, that's really interesting, thank you for your comments.
Right,
you know, it makes no difference.
Yeah.
So it's really like the circus running away with you. You know, you're really just part then of an enormous industry which is going to make the thing they want to make, and that's the thing they think will sell at the box office. And if you say, actually, it was supposed to be in some ways quite an alternative view, you know, you're not.
Did you try and say that? Were there points? You know, was there a negotiation there at all? Or?
I did pursue my view of how it should be all the way through the script process, and there was a couple of scenes that I strongly objected to, and I publicly strongly objected to that.
Was the incest scenes?
The incest doesn't bother me so much because actually I think there is historical reasons to think that was possible, and that was certainly suggested in my novel. It is what George and Anne are accused of and found guilty of. So in a way you have a really good reason for at least exploring that as a possibility. What I didn't like was the rape scene between Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn. And the reason I really didn't like it, of course, because it makes Anne Boleyn a victim of Henry's lust rather than what she was, I'm sure, which is a fantastic player with his lust. You know, she, I believe, held him off for 6 years. And that's a phenomenal amount of time to keep the King of England hopping about like a cat on a hot tin roof. I mean, take your hat off to her. There's not many women could do that, even today. So to turn that on its head and to have him the dominant, demanding part.
Why do you think the producers or the powers that be did want that scene to go in with rape?
They wanted, for the story, they wanted a twist point where you disliked Henry, where you had reason to dislike Henry. So in terms of the structure of the drama, they wanted a scene where the audience would turn against him and then he deteriorates in the eyes of the audience. And they wanted the sex scene to do that. And also they'd had a lot of idyllic sex with Mary,
Yeah.
So they needed to have that contrast to that, yeah. So in storytelling terms, I could see the point of it, but it will be one of the points where I say there's the history, there's the really good story. You should never sacrifice a history for the story.
Well, that kind of leads me quite nicely to possibly my last question about the actual process of writing history and that relationship between kind of stories and, you know, factual history as it sees itself. I mean, do you come to the historical record then with a particular idea or story, or do you let the fiction flow always directly from historical research?
It always comes out of the research, and when, you know, I'm just completing now a series of novels, and so I have prejudices about the characters, but the prejudices I'm bringing now to the new research comes out of the previous research. So although I'm bringing prejudices, they're still based on the research, they're not based on the fiction or the dramatisation. So for me, always, you start with the history, and it's what the people do that suggests to you what they're like, and that tells you how to tell their story.
Thank you so much. I found that really interesting.
My pleasure. No, thank you.
Is there any questions you want to speak about?